University of North Carolina in journalism, and I'm in the Global Inequality Research Seminar. So I work with James, who's back there in the corner on this project, and I have a journalism background, and he's a law student. So we decided to look at the topic of dowry murder from both a legal perspective and a journalistic perspective. So to start things off, a little bit of basics about what dowry murder is. Dowry murder is when a man kills his wife so that he can get a new wife and a new dowry, or when a woman kills herself as a result of dowry-related abuses. In 2012, there were 8,233 documented cases of young women being killed by dowry murder, many of whom were Dalits due to their increased discrimination and vulnerability. Of those 8,200 cases, charges were brought in about 94% of the cases, but only 32% of them resulted in conviction. However, it's important to note that the scope of the problem is actually probably much larger than that 8,200 figure depicts, just because a lot of the cases are not reported, a lot of the abuse isn't reported, and sometimes if a woman is killed, it can't be linked directly to a dowry-related abuse or murder. So a little bit of background about the legality of dowry and dowry murder. In 1961, the Dowry Prohibition Act was passed, which bans the payment of dowries as a condition for marriage. But as you guys probably well know, the practice is still largely in place. In 1986, the Indian Penal Code 304B was passed, which officially defined and punished dowry death. It required that the death had occurred within 7 years of a marriage happening. So it required that the death happened when the marriage was still relatively new. And in 2005, the Protection of Women from Domestic Act was passed, which defined domestic violence more broadly and allowed dowry-related incidents and property-related violence to be considered domestic violence. So it's those three things of which the dowry-related abuse can be punished. And a little bit of background about dowry in the news media, specifically dowry death or dowry murder. There's been relatively little research looking at the connection between news media and dowry death, but I was able to find two systematic studies that looked at it. The first study was a 1994 content analysis of dowry death-related newspaper articles, and it found three primary characteristics of the coverage. The first being that the victim was frequently reported as being a young woman in her 20s. The second was that the victim was frequently reported as being not well educated. And lastly, that the victim was frequently portrayed as wholly financially dependent on her husband or his family. And the second study was the 2008 content analysis of dowry death-related newspaper coverage in two national Indian newspapers and two regional Indian newspapers from 1999 to 2006, and it found a continuous increase in the amount of coverage during those 8 years analyzed, so that's a good thing in that the issue is being covered more. But it also found that the coverage was largely episodic, meaning that it portrayed the deaths as isolated incidents and not as an ongoing problem in society. So we did our study in the context of framing theory. So framing theory says that narratives are constructed or framed in certain ways, and frames therefore make certain aspects of the narrative or the text more accessible to readers or audiences, and therefore more likely to be used in those individuals' decision-making processes. So frames are important to study both in a legal and a media context because they have such a strong impact on how audiences will interpret the text. So the frames embedded in the text can really dictate the outcome of audiences. So this study aimed to do two things: to analyze how an elite English language newspaper in India framed the issue of dowry murder, and how the Supreme Court of India frames the facts underlying convictions of dowry death. And it's important to note that one thing that we found through our research is that the definitions of dowry murder or dowry death are very different in a legal context and a media context. In a media context, they're much broader, and dowry death is typically equated to dowry murder, but they're very different in a legal sense. In a legal sense, the punishment for a man being convicted of dowry death is 7 years. So oftentimes prosecutors try to seek just a murder conviction to get more than 7 punishment. And it can also be difficult sometimes to link abuse to specifically dowry related. So if a woman commits suicide and it can be linked to specifically the result of dowry related abuse, then it would be called dowry death. But sometimes it's really hard to make that linkage between the abuse and the suicide. So it's important to note that this definition in media context is much broader and a bit more specific in the legal sense, but they both kind of get at the same idea. So we used qualitative textual analysis to look at the frames in dowry murder-related stories in the Hindustan Times from January 2010 to December 2013, which resulted in 208 articles being analyzed, as well as relevant cases from the Supreme Court of India within that same time frame, January 2010 to December 2013, which resulted in 15 cases being analyzed. So findings from the media side of it. We found the framing was still largely episodic, meaning that it portrayed these issues as isolated incidents rather than an ongoing problem. It specified the age of the victims as being females within their 20s, largely, which makes sense in the context that dowry death has to occur within 7 years of the marriage happening. It makes sense that the female would typically be in her 20s. The coverage reflected a lot of family of the husband, so the in-laws being involved in the killing, particularly the mother-in-law. The blame was very rarely placed solely on the husband. The victim was commonly reported on having been burned to death or hung herself, so that would be sort of different definitions in the legal sense of murder if she was burned to death versus suicide if she hung herself. I found that the articles most commonly cited or referenced the father of the victim. There was very few citations from the accused or the convicted, so the family that did this, or the husband. They were rarely cited, nor were any other members of the victim's family other than her father. And there were common references to Section 304B of the Indian Penal Code, which makes dowry death illegal. And findings from the legal side, there were 15 cases analyzed, 8 convictions were affirmed, 5 defendants were acquitted, and there were 2 others. Of those 2 cases, one, the court acquitted the defendant on dowry death because it was not proved by the prosecution that the marriage was less than 7 years old, and the other was acquitted on dowry death, finding that harassment didn't sufficiently cause the suicide. So again, this is where sort of that definition and making the connection between the abuse and the death gets a little bit hard to do. We found that the framing was relatively objective, notably avoiding additional framing of facts beyond what's necessary for the holdings. And it was inherently episodic treatment of the facts, which makes sense because courts treat each case individually and are not generally called upon to address societal problems at large. So thinking about what this all means, both the legal and the media texts were framed episodically, which in the legal sense, that makes sense. It should be framed episodically and treated individually, but it's problematic from a media standpoint. Reporting on dowry death is specifically problematic because it provides audiences with no background information for why or to what extent the issue occurs. The episodic reporting doesn't allow audiences to understand the context of the problem or the complexity of the issue, and it does not lend itself to notions of sort of collective responsibility, which is something that you would want in these types of instances. Looking at the language used by the Supreme Court of India shows relative objectivity in the decisions that it reviews, consistent across all 15 cases, whether the court affirmed the conviction, acquitted, or otherwise ruled, was a relatively unbiased characterization of the facts and an even application of the law. So this analysis confirms findings from previous studies looking at media coverage of dowry death, which found that the coverage was episodic, which lends support to this notion that coverage really has not improved over the past couple of years, and that modern coverage still reflects how it used to. So I argue that if the media are to fulfill their watchdog role and to truly inform society about these issues, a wider range of frames are needed, especially moving away from the episodic framing and focusing more on thematic frames that put this in context and talk about the extent of the problem, and maybe even go as far as talking about remedies to bring an end to this. This limitations, of course. Our conclusions rested on a sample of newspaper articles from one newspaper and Supreme Court cases. So they really provide only a tentative portrait of how the topic of dowry murder is presented to audiences and lawmakers. The newspaper that we looked at is an English language newspaper, so again, I think there's value in looking at that, but it may be limited to certain audience. So I think future research should look at newspapers in varying local languages from different regions, as well as high state courts and trial level courts to get a better, more full picture of how this is being presented. Thank you.
Hey, what's up now?
Brother, what's up?
This is a groovy party, man.
Yeah,
I
brother,
can
like,
dig it.
solid. Right on.